Hi, my name is David Getsy, and I'm the curator of the gutter art of Stephen Varble, Genderqueer Performance in the 1970s, photographs by Greg Day, here at Iceberg Projects. Now, the exhibition charts the work of two different artists in the 1970s. The first is of the performance artist and playwright Stephen Varble, who engineered elaborate costumes made out of trash and food waste and found or stolen objects, and performed interventions into sites of luxury commerce, often uninvited, unauthorized, as a means of disruption and of rethinking the ways in which audiences would engage with performance art. His work often happened on the sidewalk, in the street, or bursting into places like art galleries, banks, or jewelry stores like Tiffany's. Varble would wear these costumes that confounded gender, that mixed and matched the signs that are conventionally associated with male and female in order to flout propriety and to challenge viewers to look differently at his own work. Now, and the spaces around them. Now, as I'll talk about this again later in the walkthrough, but Varble used he/him pronouns, but associated himself with his female alter ego, Marie Debris, and in his life and in his work, recombined the signs for gender in a way that is more equivalent to what we would think of as a genderqueer position today. Even though that word was not available to Varble at the time, it seems an appropriate way to think of the confrontational playing out of gender that Varble was enacting on these streets. Now, much of Varble's work has been lost. Many of the costumes have been destroyed, and we know the work primarily through his collaborations with photographers. The most important of these collaborations was with the photographer, artist, and anthropologist Greg Day, who in the mid-1970s became one of Varble's most dedicated photographers. This exhibition focuses on that intense collaborative relationship over about the space of about 18 months. That's what we focus on in this exhibition from 1975 to 1976. Now, one of the things that Varble and Day learned from this collaboration was the importance of the camera as a component of performance. And the exhibition charts the different ways that Varble would perform for the camera, or that Day's camera would be a part of the performance. Day rarely showed himself in front of the camera, but nevertheless its presence can be felt in the many different scenes that we're going to see throughout this exhibition. And we'll be tracking different kinds of locations throughout. One of the exciting things about working on this show has been able to work with Day to reconstruct some of the events around these photographs and to see them as just the tip of the iceberg of a larger performance practice and photographic practice. And one of the things that the exhibition, I think, does really well is point to a culture of performance, confrontational, genderqueer public actions that were in danger of being forgotten or completely lost if it hadn't been for Day's presence there with his camera, documenting them for us. So what I'm going to do throughout this walkthrough is we'll sort of go through the exhibition chronologically in order to give a sense of what's here in the show. And I will narrate some of the stories and the performances that occur. But throughout, I think one of the things to keep in mind is that these photographs sometimes will seem highly staged or perfectly composed, but they're always action photographs. And they happen in the heat of performance at different moments. And I think that's one of the things that makes them even more remarkable. And it's also perfectly appropriate for Varble's work to think of these as part of a larger set of actions and engagements. And so with that, why don't we start the walkthrough. These are part of the first group of photographs that Day took of Varble. And they're at the Avant-Garde Festival, which was an annual, very large collection of performance artists and avant-garde events in theater and spectacle organized by Charlotte Moorman every year. And for the festival, Varble was uninvited, but decided to show up and make a scene, as was the case. And he wore this dress that's made out of foam and has an inflatable boa, a red wig, and it was kind of colloquially called by him the French fry dress, and you can kind of see why. This picture right here is a photograph, a staged photograph of Varble dressing in the bathroom before entering out into public. So Day and Varble took the subway out to this abandoned airfield where the festival was being held, and so you can kind of see him on the runway here. And Day captured Varble as he's dressing and putting on these Mary Jane pumps, and then proceeded to explode out onto the runway and treating it like a fashion runway, so making a scene. And one of the most interesting things about this is that it was a transformative moment for both Day and Varble, because they began to realize the power of coupling performance and photography at this moment, because a bunch of teenage children saw what they understood as a man in a dress, and began to harass Varble and throw rocks at him. And Day immediately turned the camera on the kids, and they ran away and stopped. And that was a very useful moment for both of them. And they realized, as they spent the next year and a half documenting different performances, that they were both performing in a different way in the public's eye. And that even though Day never appears in front of the camera, the presence of the camera offered a kind of shield for Varble's activities. As they go on, there's a number of different performances that Varble was doing, and a range of different costumes that Day captured, and we'll see them in a different part of the exhibition. But this wall is really focused on certain key events. And these central photographs here relate to one of Varble's most widely reported at the time performances, and also one of the most elaborate and interesting, if I do say so. And this was the chemical bank protest. So what had happened was that a trick of Varble's had stolen a check from his checkbook and bought a plane ticket for using Varble's funds. Now, some people would just go to the bank and report a forged check, but Varble turned it into this grand performance. And so he arrives in this costume that is made from the netting that you would wrap a Christmas tree in to kind of keep it together so you can transport it. And it's covered with these fake, this fake currency, all of which says none dollars on it. And above his head, he has a little voice bubble that says, "Even though you may be forged, chemical banks best." And he planned this as a kind of publicity stunt to come into the bank and create this scene. And so he arrives and makes this, arrives in this outrageous costume. One of the things that is hard to see here, but I'll talk about this again in other costumes, is that he exposed a great deal of his body underneath these costumes. And so here you can see the toy fighter jet, which acts as a kind of loincloth. This is to indicate that that the plane ticket that was purchased with his funds. But he also is only wearing one shoe to signify the fact that he's now poor. So there's all of these things that he's playing with. Now, he goes into the bank and goes up to the bank manager and begins to ask, about the restitution of his funds. And clearly this causes a scene. There's all the people in the teller line that are waiting. The bank employees don't know what to do. They get various managers. And again, Varble is creating this disruption. at one point he's told to sit down and wait. And so he sits down and waits, and part of the performance is also to create an even greater scene. And so he punctures the 2 condoms that he has filled with cow's blood that were operating as the breasts of this costume. And this spills out onto this sheet that he has there, creating this whole scene, making him into this martyr-like character. And you could think of him as being like a martyr to capitalism. And this is something that he talked about quite a lot, especially in these years and the years immediately following, how much his work was a critique of value and capitalism. And he would say the end of capitalism is coming. So all of his outfits that are made out of trash, rubbish, debris, or stolen objects are all filtered in through this idea of the devalued aspects of consumerism that he revalues, and then takes this to places like Chemical Bank at Sheridan Square, which was one of the main banks at the time that was funding through loans the acquisition of property in SoHo to turn old industrial sites into lofts and housing. And so the gentrification of SoHo was happening at this time, and this is the reason Sheridan Square's Chemical Bank was chosen by Varble, as to kind of indicate this larger context and the ways in which capitalism was operating. Now, these are not conceptual performances. They're raw events that are meant to create disruption and to create confusion. And that's very much what he did. As soon as he popped the blood and it came out, he began signing checks for $9 million with a fountain pen dripped into the blood, and then proceeded to leave, where everyone in the teller line loved it. They gave him a round of applause. The bank employees were horrified, as you can imagine. The next photograph here is I think really interesting as well, in a different way. It's from the same day as the Chemical Bank protest. But this is a double portrait by day of Varble, as you can see him in the netting, with the photographer Peter Hujar, and Hujar also photographs Varble's portrait on this day and on other occasions as well. This beautiful little portrait kind of gives us a sense of one of the larger themes that I've already mentioned, which is that Varble's practice was really done in collaboration with photographers, and he courted photographers to help him create this kind of image that you see throughout the exhibition. And Day was the most consistent and the sort of highest output of the photographers that Varble worked with, but we'll see a couple other comparisons later in the exhibition. I will just conclude with this last image here to talk about another great moment of performance. In 1975, there was the Rizzoli bookstore in New York decided, which is this sort of famous place where a kind of site of cultural exchange and cultural knowledge in the 1970s, they decided to start having exhibitions. It was a very large store at the time. And one of the first ones they had was curated in relationship to Andy Warhol. He was not that involved, but he was used as the kind of lure. It was called Fashion as Fantasy. And it had many different artists there who were invited to display works in relationship to the fashion industry in the bookstore galleries. Varble was not invited again, but he had to be there, and he had to be at the opening. So he shows up in the piggy bank dress, which is this combination of forms that are both phallic and labial, and they relate to this kind of confounding of gender. And I'll talk about that in just a second. But the other thing to note about the piggy bank dress is that the breasts of this costume were bags that were filled with pennies. And so when Varble arrived at the front gate, or the front door, trying to get in, he pulled the strings that released the pennies out on the floor, and that and this kind of outrageous costume where he's got this wig on a spring over his bald head or bald cap at the time. This created such a scene that they had to let him in, and so he was there as part of the party because of this intervention. Well, just a minute ago I was talking about the question of nakedness in Varble's performances, and I think this is an important point in thinking about the larger stakes of what he's doing with gender. As I was talking about, the kind of genderqueer potential of his performances is in the costumes themselves that recombine signs for gender, collapse them together, and confuse them. And this was very much an active set of questions for Varble's work. In many of the performances, Varble allowed his unclothed body to be seen under fairly skimpy outfits. And this was part of a strategy to create a kind of contradiction between the gendered dress or garb that he's wearing and the expectations that viewers would bring to seeing an unclothed body and assigning a gender to it. Now, we also have to remember this happened on the street, too. So this isn't just private performances, but there was a little bit of shock that was happening there as well. Here, I'm standing next to a reconstruction of one of Varble's dresses, perhaps one of the most widely photographed in the 1970s, one called the Pearl Dress. And it was originally the concluding dress for a performance called The Fountain of Safety, which capped off one of Varble's costume tours of New York, where he would go through various sites, especially in SoHo and Fifth Avenue, and lead these kind of disruptive group performances where he would bring people in tow as if he was a tour guide to different galleries and cause problems with them. In the Pearl Dress, Varble found a gallery to agree to let him use their water hookup without quite knowing what they were getting into, and he brought along a long hose and began spraying people on the street wearing this. And he's wearing, of course, a life vest in this, so to indicate that there's this danger in the water that's happening. And he's the savior of those people who are in the deluge, and he thought in these kind of heroic terms. Now, this particular dress is great in that it has this fantastic cheese grater as a headdress. This is a life vest that he stole from the Staten Island Ferry. He was an adjunct professor of theater at what is now the College of Staten Island, so he had to take the ferry once a week. And he just, one of his inspirational moments was when he realized he could spirit away one of the life vests. Now, I'm going to show you the photograph of the dress in just a moment, but this particular object is a reconstruction, as I said, done by the Brooklyn-based artist Vincent Tiley, who, working from photographs, reconstructed Varble's elaborate and completely ad hoc construction methods to recreate this costume. And this was originally done for the retrospective exhibition at the Leslie Lohman in 2018, and we felt it was important to try and materialize some of Varble's costumes again. Even though, as I said, many of them had been destroyed, he recombined them. They were also sometimes made from very ephemeral materials. But Vincent did a fantastic job in sort of recreating this, and we've got this kind of pink mannequin underneath just to focus on the dress itself. And as I'm going to show you in the photograph in just a second, the thing that really became clear to us when we reconstructed the dress was just how naked he was underneath all of this. And this is, in fact, one of the reasons why he had many of his run-ins with police. It was not the disruption or spilling the milk in the galleries or obstructing the entrance to Tiffany's. It was often questions of public nudity. And again, this is a strategy for Varble, and part of this larger short-circuiting of our expectations of gender. Because one of the key things that goes throughout Varble's practice is this idea of not being limited to a binary gender and confrontationally bringing together different signs for gender and confusing them. He often performed with a beard and one of these outfits, not exclusively so, and he would make sure that people were confused. Now this is, again, important when we think about Varble as an artist who takes the detritus of culture, trash, rubbish, discarded objects, things that people have no use for or value for, and he finds a new use for them. He remakes trash into his own image. And this activity of transformation, transmutation even, of these discarded objects was part of a larger set of questions for Varble about how to bring new life and new energy to areas that had been devalued. Gender and the body for Varble are very much these received scripts, these received things that he remakes and recombines and uses in ways that they weren't intended for. And so you can see both in the way that Cheese Grater becomes this fantastic headdress, that strategy of remaking, of not relying on the expected use of that object, but making it into something that it was never intended for. This is also how he approaches gender. And that is displayed in elaborate form in the costumes themselves and in his performances that brought that confrontational recombination, that self-made, that ad hoc, non-binary options for gender, that brought that into the streets and confronted viewers with that. So here's a photograph of the pearl dress. Now this is not by Greg Day, it's by Jack Mitchell, and I'll explain in a second. But this is a staged studio shot. One of the ones that Varble did with Mitchell. But first I want to focus on the dress, because here you can really see the intricate construction and how naked Varble was underneath. Now again, this is part of the agenda of these works, is to create these confrontations. And you'll notice like this central area with the genitals. This is an odd, invented genital form that is neither of the conventional sets of genitals one might expect, but rather some new version of that. And that kind of confusion is very much what Varble was interested in. Now, this photograph, as I said, was taken by Jack Mitchell, and in the exhibition we have a small selection of other photographers that Varble also collaborated with. And this just kind of gives us a set of comparative images, but also allows us to see the wider range of Varble's practice. And we included the Mitchell, particularly because we had the reconstruction of the pearl dress here, but I think it gives you a good sense of how different Day's photographs are. Again, Day is photographing in actual situations in public or in abandoned buildings rather than in a studio. And it's a very different kind of photographic practice. Varble cultivated relationships with lots of different kinds of photographers. Earlier we saw Peter Hujar, who also photographed Varble. And these works by Mitchell were intended as kind of publicity photographs and used in a different way. But I like having it in the show because it shows how different and how vibrant Day's photographs are in terms of their action. The Mitchell photograph's also great, it's just of a different, character of photography. Now, with that, I'm going to turn to the other comparative photographer we have in the show, and these are 3 black and white photographs by Jimmy Desana, who, especially in the 1970s, was doing a lot of photography for newspapers. And again, he became one of Varble's photographers. Now, these black and whites are interesting because they relate to a series of photographs that Greg Day also did. But first I'll start with the middle one, because Varble's performances often were very impromptu. They had to be generally pretty quick because otherwise they would get disrupted or the police would come. We have relatively few photographs in general of the the interventions. And remember I showed you earlier the chemical bank intervention, which we had like a great set of photographs from. But this central one is a photograph of Varble performing his performance gutter art, in which he's washing pans in the gutter outside Fifth Avenue store. It's Ann Taylor's store. I like this photograph in the show because it shows a different aspect of Varble's performance, and that is the audience. And again, this is something that's very much a part of all of these works, is the presence of the audience in addition to the camera. Now, the other two photographs came from a really interesting day. Varble, in October of 1975, invited Desana to take photographs of him in multiple costumes. And the idea is that they would go to the roof of the building and create a set of images that could be used that sort of documented all of the costumes. So Desana showed up, and he was told to bring black and white film, and to shoot this, and he thought that he was going to be the photographer that day. But he showed up, and Greg Day was also there, because Varble had made another invitation to Day without telling him about Desana, just as he didn't tell Desana that day, and had them both show up there with Desana shooting in black and white and Greg Day shooting in color. And this, of course, caused a little bit of competition between the two. They worked it out. But we have, from this single day, a remarkable documentation of Varble's costumes from two different photographers shooting side by side. Now let's take a look at Day's versions of this. Now, these are some of the most spectacular photographs in the show, I think, and they represent some of the best documentation of Varble's costumes. These are not public performances, because they were happening on the roof of Varble's building, and it's really, they really show Varble performing for these two cameras at the same time. And so this image is of Varble destroying a blue and green dress that he had made out of corrugated cardboard. That same image, that same dress we saw in the top Desana photograph. And there's a whole series of these photographs in which Varble's progressively, with a knife, cutting away at this cardboard costume that he's wearing, destroying it for the purpose of this performance. And it's just a great image. The other costumes were not destroyed in the same way, but they also represent some of these other key moments in Varble's practice. We have here the Elizabethan farthingale. A farthingale is a Renaissance dress that had many hoops underneath it, and Varble recreates this dress out of egg crates and string, and then starts posing in ways that are similar to Renaissance paintings. Now, this particular outfit was made for a special performance. The German artist Joseph Beuys was in New York and had an opening for an exhibition at Ronald Feldman Gallery, and Varble wore the Elizabethan farthingale to show up, and he did a performance that we don't have any documentation of called Love Story for Joseph Beuys. And this work, you can imagine what a showstopper this is, with its elaborate with its elaborate folds and everything. And it's a great example of this kind of inventiveness. Now, this particular dress in particular wasn't used that often, I think because it was probably too fragile. And so it's only really through this single day of photography by Day and Desana that we know that it exists at all. Because this is one of the ones that didn't make it into other photographs. Many of the other dresses that he made would be recycled and you'd see them later, but that's not so much the case. The final photograph on this wall is an example of a dress that got reused quite a lot by Varble, and it's a fantastic one. He called it the suit of armor, and it's made from the gold foil liquor boxes of Seagram's liquor, and it's the trim of it is made of six-pack holders, and his headdress is used tea bags, among other things. And he's wearing a green boa that he stole, or was given, stolen, it's a little ambiguous, from his friend Fernanda Eberstadt's mother. Now, this work, this gold suit of armor, Varble would wear in many different locations. So he would wear it to the Easter parade, for instance, in 1975, but he would also wear it out to leather bars in the evening near the West Side piers. And this was very much part of Varble's practice, was to go places where there were expectations about how one should be seen and look, and he would disrupt in these outfits. And taken together, these three photographs kind of represent a range of different inventive practices and give us some of the best images of Varble in the 1970s that capture the inventiveness of these costumes, but also his modes of performance, from posing like an ingenue to this kind of beatific pose in the Elizabethan farthingale, to the kind of sensual performance of disruption that he's engaging with in the blue and green cardboard dress. And these photographs, again, come from this remarkable day on the roof. And one of the things that we also did in the show was we had so many photographs of this day that we also have in the show a slideshow of the other photographs that were taken that day, which sequentially give a sense of Varble's performance and movements and the inventiveness of the ways in which he was inhabiting these dresses. And that was a way to kind of bring some of the performance art, not just the costume art, not just the photography, but the performance art to life. All right, well, as I said, Varble created this retrospective of his works in April of 1976, and he ended it with a grand party, this kind of closing gala for this. Now, this itself was a work of art, and Varble conceived of this as this grand collaboration. He got some of the most important performance artists and celebrities of the day to engage with him and to be his living mannequins. And so here we have a series of days images from this closing party. For instance, this is Taylor Mead, the Warhol star, and this is Augusto Machado, who's from the Angels of Light. And I'll show you a couple other in just a second. And they all wore the dresses as if they were living mannequins to show it off. Now, this was a wild party. In the course of my research, I've talked to a few people who were at the party, Day included, and almost no one can remember anything about it. For instance, when I was talking to Augusto, it was very blurry in his response, but he remembered how this photograph happened, where he's in the refrigerator doing a performance of camp claustrophobia. And you can see that he's wearing the suit of armor that we talked about before and creating a sort of little mini event. This party was full of such mini events. And I love this photograph in particular because it gives a sense not only of Varble's dress, but also this fantastic performer, Augusto Machado, who's really living it up and selling that dress. Now, when we go over here to some of these other works, here to the far right is the important Warhol star and entertainer Jackie Curtis, who's wearing a fantasy football outfit that Varble had made to wear to the Met Gala. But again, it's a good indication of all of the different people that were involved in the in this wild closing party. Here you have an image of Ruth Truth, a New York drag queen and street performer at the time, wearing actually not a dress that is one of Varble's, but one of his own. But you can see in the backdrop the Elizabethan farthingale, which is here still intact, but probably not for long. And all of these photographs, again, were taken in the course of a performance event, a performance night. The big photograph in the center is an image of the key performance for this evening. Varble, with the assistance of the artist John Eric Brodus, created a sculptural object called the enormous pink satin skirt. And this was a huge pink satin skirt, as you can imagine. And the kind of high point of this crazy, engaged, and wild party was when all of the Warhol stars wearing Varble's costumes hid inside the pink skirt and then ceremoniously cut it open as if they were being birthed into the party, and they burst forward. And here we have this moment when they're cutting things out. And, from the right to the left, we have Paul Ambrose. Paul Ambrose is right there. There's Augusto Machado, Ruth Truth, and in the far end is Mario Montez, the important performance artist who also was in many of Warhol's films. Now, this was a big gambit by Varble to produce this kind of event where he had a different generation of performers and artists who had also complicated received narratives of gender. And here Varble created this performance event in which they became part of his work itself, and he sort of absorbed everyone into it. These 4 photographs of the closing party, I think, are remarkable to kind of get a sense of how varied Varble's practice was. And costumes that were made for the street and these performance interventions, they're also played out in this manufactured spectacle that the art critic Gregory Badcock said was one of the most wild parties of the year. So this is a fitting way to end the walkthrough, but also the exhibition, because it was soon after the closing party that Day had to continue his studies and field work for his degree in anthropology and left New York. And that marks an endpoint of this intense period of collaboration. The two remained friends, and there's other photographs that Day took later on. And Day also appears in Varble's video, Journey to the Sun, which we also included in the exhibition. But what I think is remarkable about this friendship, this collaboration, especially as indicated over just a year and a half, was what a burst of energy there was and opportunity that both Varble and Day seized upon to create a new form of cultural production and to record it with a density and a richness that we rarely have for such impromptu, unauthorized performance art. And it's this kind of energy of that 18 months that this show is about, because this kind of work is exactly what needs to be remembered. The fact that there were artists and photographers on the streets demanding different accounts of gender and sexuality, and of thinking more broadly about what performance or art could be. And oftentimes such bold interventions, anti-institutional interventions, are lost or forgotten. And I'm really grateful for Greg Day being there with his camera to capture this intense moment that we hope to show you at the exhibition. So thank you for joining us through the walkthrough, and hope you'll come by to see the exhibition.